People throw around words like trailblazer and pioneer all the time, but today we're talking about someone who truly earned those titles. Born a century after Beethoven on the opposite side of the world, yet she became the first Japanese composer to write music in a Western classical style. And if you learn to play an instrument via the Suzuki Method, well, her impact might be closer than you think. This is the story of Nobu Kōda, the groundbreaking composer and educator you definitely need to know about. Welcome to Chords and Queens. It's no secret that female composers have been largely overlooked in the classical canon. And yes, over the last 30 years, there's been some progress and more women are being programmed on concert stages and entering the field as composers. But how much progress are we really talking about? Well, let's look at the numbers. A study by Donne Music analysed the 2023-24 season from 111 orchestras worldwide, and the results were honestly pretty depressing, with only 7.5% of works performed were written by women. And when you break it down even further, Asian female composers made up just 0.5% of that figure, which is just so incredibly low. And speaking from experience, in my entire school music education, I didn't encounter a single woman who was a composer, and it was eventually through my own digging that I discovered names like Fanny Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann, and even maybe more contemporary figures like Helen Grime. But they all had one thing in common, and that was they were all white. And I think we need to change that, so the next time someone Googles female composers, perhaps the results shouldn't all look the same. Which brings me to today's story, not just about a phenomenal composer whose music deserves to be heard, but about someone whose life was extraordinary in its own right. She was a Japanese composer, violinist, and educator, and her name was Nobu Kōda. And I want to address this before I start that some of my research shows her name to be Kōda Nobu, because I believe in Japan it's usually the family name that goes first, but the majority of the musicology research does refer to her as Nobu Kōda, so that's what I'll use within this episode because it's what appears when I Google her. But if I'm wrong, I do apologise and do let me know if it needs to be corrected. Let's talk about her early years. And Nobu Kōda was born on the 19th of April 1870 in Tokyo during the Meiji Restoration, which was a period when Japan rapidly transformed from an isolated feudal nation into a more industrial state. And if you don't know what a feudal nation means, don't worry, neither did I, but according to Google, it's a period of Japanese history from the 12th to 19th centuries where military rule led by a shogun replaced imperial rule with the samurai warrior class dominating society. Basically, where a strict social hierarchy, or in my mind like a pyramid, existed with the emperor as a figurehead, the shogun as the military dictator, and regional lords known as daimyo controlling land and samurai, and peasants really at the bottom. And land was granted in exchange for military service, creating a decentralized system with frequent internal conflicts among the daimyo. So this period of time was over and essentially a new chapter was beginning, with the government actively promoting westernization in education, music, and social customs as part of a national modernization strategy. Western music, known as yokagu, was officially introduced into the school system in 1879, and things like Western military bands became symbols of this national progress. And our young Nobu Kōda actually came from one of these former samurai families, part of the Shizoku class, who were encouraged to take on new roles in civil service, education, and the arts after the dissolution of this feudal hierarchy. And well, this status gave her access to elite educational circles that probably most women and even most men in Japan would not have had at the time. And so at age 7, Nobu began formal studies in koto and shamisen, which are two of Japan's most prestigious court and folk instruments. But unlike most young women of her time, her education did not stop at traditional arts. Her father, recognizing the changing tides of Japanese society, supported all of his children in pursuing both traditional and Western arts, which I believe was a rare attitude for the era. Because back in the late 1800s, Japanese women were being told that their main purpose in life was to become what the government literally called a good wife, wise mother, or or Ryosai Kembo, and it was a big national campaign during this Meiji era, meant to shape women into educated homemakers who could raise smart, morally well-rounded children and support their husbands for the good of the country. So while women were encouraged to study, it was usually so they could teach their kids later, not so they could chase personal dreams or build careers of their own. But Nobu didn't quite fit into that mold now, did she? And why was that? Well, because she had ambition and what looks like the rare support of a family that actually encouraged her to go after it. And at a time when almost no Japanese women attended college, she enrolled at the Tokyo Music School, which we now know as Tokyo University of the Arts. And this was Japan's very first Western-style music conservatory. And Nobu was part of its first ever graduating class in 1885. Just 3 women out of 22 students, which is actually pretty remarkable when you think about how restricted women's education was at this time. And at Tokyo Music School, she continued her studies in traditional Japanese instruments like the koto, but also was being exposed to Western classical music, which was just starting to make its way into Japan. And her passion for Western music developed quickly, and she became especially drawn to the violin, which had only recently been introduced to Japan through these European military bands and foreign teachers. She studied under Nakamura Sen, who worked as assistant and translator for Luther Whiting Mason, who was an American music educator that the Japanese government had brought over to help modernize their music curriculum. And I believe Mason was actually one of the key figures behind the introduction of Western-style music education in Japan, and Nobu learned directly through that early pipeline. Then in 1889, Nobu did something almost unthinkable for a Japanese woman at the time. She went abroad to study music, which is actually really impressive because it was actually the government that recognized her talent and sent her off to Boston, studied violin and piano at the New England Conservatory. And while she was there, she actually reconnected with Mason, who became one of her mentors and even gifted her a violin made by the famous Amati family, which is one of the most renowned instrument makers in the world, let me just say. But Nobu didn't stop there. With Mason's encouragement, she headed to Vienna, which is essentially the heart of European classical music, where she studied from 1890 to 1895 at the Vienna Conservatory. There, she took violin lessons with Joseph Helmsberger II, who also taught the legendary Fritz Kreisler, and studied composition and counterpoint with Robert Fuchs, whose students included names like Gustav Mahler and Jean Sibelius, and those influences really show in Kōda's later compositions, which carry that lush emotional depth that very typical of that German romantic style. So while unfortunately most women in Japan were being shaped into ideal wives and mothers, Nobu Kōda was halfway across the world mastering the same musical traditions as Europe's greats, and without knowing it, actually paving the way for generations of Japanese classical musicians to follow. After 6 years in Europe, Nobu returned home to Japan in 1895, and she didn't come back quietly. Almost immediately, she joined the faculty at the Tokyo Music School, bringing with her first-hand experience from Vienna, and this made her a bit of a phenomenon in Japan. She wasn't just teaching Western music, she had been there surrounded by it, had walked the walk if you will, but not everyone liked that, especially because she's often credited as the first Japanese composer to write in the Western classical style, and that goes for male or female. While teaching, Nobu also kept performing, and she teamed up with her younger sister Ando, an incredible violinist in her own right, who studied in Germany under Joseph Joachim, who is one of the most celebrated violinists of the 19th century. And together, the two sisters performed Nobu's own Violin Sonata No. 1 in 1895, marking one of the earliest performances of a Western-style sonata written by a Japanese composer. But Nobu didn't stop there. She gave Japanese premieres of major Western works, including Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, Bach's Concerto for 2 violins, and Beethoven's string quartets. These were pieces most audiences in Japan had never heard live before, and reviewers praised her technical precision and expressive playing, something virtually unheard of from a Japanese performer at that time. And still, her success came with a hefty price. The novelty of a woman mastering Western music eventually wore off, and the admiration she once received began to twist into resentment. Many of her male colleagues, which I'm assuming were just threatened by her confidence, talent, and even her ability to probably speak fluent German and English. Well, they turned against her and the criticism became personal. It was gossip, name-calling, outright bullying from both within the school and in the press. By 1909, Nobu had had enough. She resigned from her position at the Tokyo Music School and took a year-long sabbatical through Europe, revisiting the cities that had shaped her, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and London. But I don't think this was a retreat or a quick vacay, because Nobu used the trip to observe how music was taught abroad, sitting in on classes, studying the different curriculums and networking, I'm sure with other progressive women musicians who were also pushing for equality in education and the arts. And when she returned to Japan, she decided to take matters into her own hands and opened a private music school in her home, where she taught piano and violin to upper-class girls, and even members of the Japanese imperial family. She poured her heart into teaching, constantly improving her methods and organizing performance opportunities for her students with orchestras. And here's where her legacy really starts to echo forward, because among her students were two names that left an incredible mark on music history. One of them was Shinichi Suzuki, who would later develop the world-famous Suzuki Method for teaching children to play instruments. And it was Nobu who encouraged him to follow his dream and study in Germany, an experience that shaped his philosophy that every child can learn music, not just prodigies. Which is quite a crazy moment for me, because when I learned to play the violin at age like 6 or 7, my first book was the Suzuki Method. So it feels wild that I grew up not knowing or playing any female composers, but little did I know the book I'm learning from, well, literally the person who taught him was an outstanding female composer. Another of her students was Rintaro Taki, the composer behind Kimigayo, Japan's national anthem. Even beyond teaching though, Nobu continued to compose. She wrote a symphony with chorus for Emperor Taisho's ascension ceremony in 1912, and she helped found Japan's first string quartet, performing alongside some of the finest musicians of her time. Nobu Kōda's story is more than just a chapter in Japan's musical history. She lived at a time when women were told to serve quietly, yet she chose to be heard. Through her talent and determination, she bridged the two worlds between Japanese tradition and Western music, all while redefining what it meant to be a Japanese musician in a rapidly changing world. And although the society at the time wasn't quite ready to embrace her brilliance, her influence rippled through her students, her performances, and the barriers she broke simply by existing where no woman had before. Every young woman studying music, writing in her own voice, and every child learning an instrument through the Suzuki Method carries a piece of Nobu Kōda's legacy. She may not have received the legacy she deserved, as her sheet music is proving impossible to get a hold of and recordings of her work are scarce, but her courage to step beyond expectation has certainly left a lasting mark on me. I hope her story reminds us that true pioneers aren't always the most successful or well known or most played. They're usually the ones with the stories hidden in the archives, because their impact appears the smallest, even though it was probably the first spark in the blaze of change. And as I wrap up this episode, I hope you've been inspired to seek out the work of Nobu Kōda for yourself. My recommendations for her work include her Violin Sonata No. 2 in D minor. I think that's probably one of my favorite works for the violin ever. It's so beautiful. And there's also a few piano pieces in there, but yes, please go and listen to her works and let's borderline harass some publishers, because I need copies of her music. And with that, let us take our final bow for today. I hope you enjoyed getting to know this incredible human a little better. And if you like this episode and want to discover even more stories about other remarkable female composers, make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you prefer watching, well, you can find us on YouTube. And if you want more bite-sized stories, music recommendations, and the latest classical music news, come hang out with me on Instagram and TikTok, as I share lots of fun content, and you can find that over on @Chords and Queens. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, I'll see you again soon.